In a shattered city, where towering skyscrapers lie in ruin and the air hums with the eerie sound of alien invaders, humanity's last stand has begun. Soldiers, battered but unbroken, fight desperately against monstrous creatures whose overwhelming force has already torn their world apart. With every step of the enemy, the ground trembles, and with every gunshot, the hope of survival fades a little more. Yet, amid the chaos and despair, there remains a spark of defiance. Can humanity hold the line long enough to turn the tide, or is this the final chapter of their existence? The city was a hollow shell of its former self, the towering skyscrapers now mere remnants of a once thriving urban landscape. Where they had once pierced the sky, their skeletal remains jutted into the air, jagged and broken like the teeth of some monstrous creature. The buildings were riddled with cracks and gaps, the glass windows shattered and hanging in pieces, reflecting the faint and unsettling glow of the blood-red sun. This dim light struggled to push through the thick, suffocating haze that hung heavily in the air, giving everything an eerie, otherworldly hue. The streets, once bustling with life, now resembled a battlefield strewn with debris. Cars and wreckage were scattered across the ground, twisted and mangled, a testament to the chaos that had swept through the city. The remnants of human civilization lay abandoned, its people either gone or hidden, as if the city itself was slowly being swallowed by the aftermath of some great catastrophe. Scorched remnants of buildings smoldered in the distance, their foundations crumbling under the weight of time and destruction. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, a quiet, unsettling hum reverberating through the air. It wasn't the sound of wind or machinery, but something far more alien, something that seemed to pulse from the very heart of the city. This hum, unlike anything the soldiers had heard before, sent an instinctive shiver down their spines, signaling the presence of something far beyond their understanding. The quietness of the city, broken only by the occasional explosion or distant rumble, was almost suffocating, amplifying the sense of isolation. The whole environment felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, for the next attack to come. In the shadow of the decaying city, the soldiers found themselves in an almost surreal scenario. Every step they took seemed to echo in the emptiness, as if the world itself was watching them. The city's once proud skyline now stood as a broken monument to the failure of humankind, a grim reminder of what had been lost in the wake of the invasion. The alien invaders towered over the battlefield, their massive forms casting long, ominous shadows across the ruined city. Their exoskeletons, resembling those of predatory insects, glinted dully in the faint light filtering through the thick, smoky air. These creatures were a grotesque sight, with armored plates covering their bodies, reflecting an unnatural sheen that seemed almost too perfect, too mechanical for anything natural. The way they moved was unsettling, graceful yet predatory, their movements swift and precise, as though they had been designed for this exact purpose: destruction. Their heads were bulbous, pulsing faintly with a blue glow that appeared to shift in intensity with every movement. The glow illuminated the alien faces in a chilling way, making their large, black, multifaceted eyes appear even more unsettling. These eyes were not just a feature. They were a tool of unimaginable efficiency, scanning every corner of the battlefield with unnerving precision. It felt as if each soldier was being observed, analyzed, and judged, as if the aliens could read every move and anticipate every tactic. They were not merely invaders. They were intelligent, calculating, and prepared for whatever resistance humanity could throw at them. The alien creatures moved with terrifying power. Their limbs, long and segmented, were capable of unimaginable feats. They tore through vehicles with ease, crushing metal and stone as though it were paper, effortlessly dismantling anything in their path. Their movements were almost fluid, coiling and uncoiling like the limbs of a predatory insect, delivering strikes that were both graceful and horrifying. The sound of their bodies moving through the wreckage was almost deafening, sharp clicks and deep vibrations, a constant reminder of the threat they posed. They seemed to destroy not out of anger, but with a purpose, methodical and unyielding in their approach. The air was filled with a chorus of alien sounds. High-pitched clicks and screeches echoed across the battlefield, incomprehensible to human ears, but clearly signaling a deeper form of communication. It wasn't random noise. It was a language, a structured series of sounds that resonated with the chilling coordination of a hive mind. Every click, every screech seemed to carry a command, a signal to the other invaders to attack, retreat, or adjust their strategy. The creatures moved in sync, their actions so coordinated that it felt as if they were a single entity rather than an army of individuals. This unnerving unity was part of what made them so dangerous. Their ability to function as one unstoppable force, to adapt to the changing tides of battle without hesitation or falter. Amid the chaos, the soldiers remained steadfast, crouched behind makeshift barricades that were hastily constructed from anything they could salvage. Their helmets, battered from constant combat, concealed grim expressions, but their eyes, though masked, betrayed the fear and determination that coursed through them. They knew they were fighting against something far beyond their comprehension, but they had no choice but to hold the line. Each soldier's weapon was locked onto the approaching invaders, their fingers tense on the triggers, waiting for the next order to fire. The command came through the crackling radios, the voice of their officer cutting through the noise of distant explosions. "Hold the line!" The order was firm, unwavering, yet the sound of the officer's voice barely reached their ears over the blaring sirens and thunderous blasts. Despite the chaos, the soldiers obeyed without question, their training taking over. They fired in synchronized bursts, their rifles sending a steady stream of bullets toward the alien invaders. But each round seemed to have little effect. The aliens' thick, insect-like exoskeletons absorbed the gunfire without even flinching, the bullets sparking harmlessly off their armored bodies, barely slowing their relentless advance. The soldiers' resolve was tested again and again. From the rear, the rumble of tanks filled the air, the heavy artillery launching shells that tore through the sky, exploding upon contact with the alien creatures. For a brief moment, it seemed like the tanks might make a difference. One of the aliens staggered, its screech reverberating across the battlefield as the force of the blast threw it back. But the victory was short-lived. The alien regained its footing almost immediately, its massive limbs swiping through the air to swat away a tank as if it were nothing more than a toy. The tank crumpled under the force, its crew scrambling for cover as the creature loomed over them, towering and unstoppable. As the battle raged on, Lieutenant Harris crouched low, his heart racing in his chest as he observed the devastation around him. The ground shook with each step the aliens took, the very earth trembling under the weight of their movements. His rifle felt heavier in his hands. Each round fired a futile attempt to slow down the invaders. Sweat mixed with grime on his face, and his fingers, slick with fear, struggled to load another magazine into the rifle. The sounds of destruction and death were all around him, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand, pushing down the rising panic. They weren't unstoppable, at least not yet. He knew they had to hold out a little longer, just long enough for something, anything, to turn the tide in their favor. The ground beneath Lieutenant Harris seemed to pulse with every footfall of the approaching aliens, the tremors sending a ripple of anxiety through his body. His breathing quickened, but he forced himself to remain steady, focusing on the small barricade in front of him. The gunfire continued to echo across the battlefield, but the aliens were relentless, pushing forward despite the barrage. Harris wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers unsteady as they gripped the fresh magazine. His rifle was ready, but it felt like every shot was a drop in an ocean of resistance. The fear gnawing at him was hard to suppress, but he clung to the single thought that kept him grounded. They weren't invincible. Not yet. A voice crackled through the communication system, the words heavy with panic. "They're unstoppable." The soldier's voice was desperate, but Harris couldn't afford to let fear take over. "Not yet," he muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the horizon where the alien forces pressed closer. The sound of explosions filled the air, but none of the blasts seemed to be enough to halt their advance. In the distance, the remnants of a building smoked, where the human forces had set up heavy artillery. That weapon could make a difference, if they could just hold out a little longer. The distant whine of drones buzzed overhead, their cameras capturing the carnage below. Harris glanced up for a moment, watching as one of the drones, loaded with a missile, soared through the ashen sky. With a sharp hiss, the missile shot down, crashing directly into the heart of the alien formation. The resulting explosion sent a shockwave rippling across the ground, sending debris flying and momentarily halting the advance of the invaders. For a fleeting moment, Harris felt a surge of hope. The enemy was vulnerable, but that hope was short-lived as more of the aliens emerged from the smoke, seemingly undeterred by the loss of their comrades. Their numbers appeared endless. As the second wave of aliens surged forward, the battlefield seemed to shift again. Despite the missile strike, the creatures regrouped with terrifying efficiency, stepping over the bodies of their fallen without hesitation. They seemed to know no fear, no retreat. Harris's pulse raced as he glanced around for any sign of a break in the tide, but the enemy's unyielding nature weighed heavily on him. The soldiers around him, their faces grim beneath their helmets, continued to fight, holding their ground with desperation but not without purpose. In the midst of it all, Harris steadied his rifle once more, his eyes narrowing with determination. There was still a chance, still hope as long as they stood together. But the moment of uncertainty lingered, the ever-present question hanging in the air. How much longer could they endure? In the midst of the destruction, Major Elena Reyes took command, her voice cutting through the static of fear that had begun to choke the soldiers' resolve. As the battle raged around her, her calm demeanor served as a steady anchor, providing the soldiers with the clarity they needed to focus. She observed the movements of the alien forces through the lens of her scope, calculating every moment with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Her orders were succinct, direct, focus fire on their joints. She knew the key to slowing them down was to target their vulnerabilities, and she had learned quickly that the thick exoskeletons alone weren't enough to shield their limbs from attack. With her orders given, Reyes's sniper rifle cracked with a sharp report as she took aim at one of the alien's legs. The bullet tore through the air and struck its target, the creature stumbling as its limb buckled under the force of the hit. The alien reeled back, its screech of pain reverberating through the chaos, and for a brief moment, the human forces felt a flicker of hope. They had made a small dent in the seemingly indomitable enemy. Around her, the soldiers followed suit, their rifles barking in unison as they targeted the joints of the alien creatures. Every successful hit seemed to slow the invaders just a little more, but their resilience was undeniable. Yet, despite this brief advantage, the aliens adapted with unnerving speed. The creatures began to move faster, more erratically, almost as if they had anticipated the human strategy. Their limbs coiled and uncoiled in fluid motions, twisting and snapping with the speed of a whip, making it more difficult to land accurate shots. One of the aliens lashed out, its long, clawed appendage sweeping through a squad of soldiers before they could retreat. The devastating swipes left destruction in their wake, the sounds of soldiers screaming as they were torn apart filling the air. The horror of it was immediate, but there was no time for mourning, no space for fear. They had to press on. Even as the enemy adapted and the casualties mounted, Major Reyes refused to back down. She knew that their best chance of survival lay in the energy weapon that was being assembled behind their lines. Engineers worked feverishly, their hands moving in a blur as they connected wires and calibrated the prototype. It was humanity's last desperate hope, an unstable energy weapon that could potentially tip the scales in their favor. When the weapon was finally ready, Reyes gave the order to fire. A deafening hum filled the air as the weapon charged, its barrel glowing with intense, unstable energy. The soldiers shielded their eyes from the blinding flash as the weapon discharged, sending a beam of concentrated power directly into the chest of one of the alien titans. The impact was immediate and devastating. The alien let out a blood-curdling screech of agony as it staggered, its massive body collapsing to the ground with a thunderous crash that shook the very earth beneath their feet. For a brief moment, there was a stunned silence, the battlefield momentarily frozen in disbelief. But the victory was fleeting. The remaining aliens, furious and undeterred, turned their attention to the weapon, recognizing the threat it posed. Their movements grew more aggressive, their attacks more violent, and the battle shifted once again. Despite the brief triumph, the war was far from over. The soldiers braced themselves for the next wave, their hearts heavy but their spirits unbroken. The battle for the city continued to rage, smoke and fire consuming what little remained of the urban landscape. The tension in the air was palpable, each passing moment inching humanity closer to the brink of total annihilation. Despite the mounting losses, the soldiers pressed on, their will to survive and protect their world driving them forward. The aliens had shown themselves to be relentless, their numbers seemingly endless, and every human casualty only served to heighten the sense of hopelessness. But there was still a flicker of defiance in the soldiers' hearts, a refusal to surrender, no matter the odds stacked against them. The alien invaders pressed forward with horrifying precision, their movements unyielding as they tore through the remnants of humanity's defenses. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shudder with every step, the earth shaking as they advanced. Yet, even as the soldiers faced impossible odds, they continued to fight. Their rifles, their tanks, and their makeshift weapons were all that stood between them and total destruction. There were moments of brilliance, small victories that offered brief glimpses of hope, such as the successful strike on the alien leader. But those moments were quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming force of the invaders. In the midst of the chaos, there were soldiers like Lieutenant Harris, whose determination never wavered. He had seen his comrades fall, heard their screams, and watched as the city around him was reduced to nothing but a war-torn wasteland. But despite the terror gnawing at his insides, he refused to give in to fear. Every time he reloaded his weapon, every time he took aim at another alien, he was reminded of what he was fighting for, the survival of humanity. The war was brutal, unforgiving, but as long as there was breath in his lungs, he would continue to fight. He was not alone in this struggle. Others, too, held the line with the same resolve, determined to protect what remained of their world. The soldiers were outnumbered, outgunned, and faced with an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. But their resilience, their unwavering spirit, was their greatest weapon. They had seen their world crumble, watched as everything they knew was torn apart, yet they stood firm in the face of extinction. With each passing hour, the line between hope and despair grew thinner. But it was in those moments of uncertainty that humanity's true strength emerged. The soldiers knew the battle was far from over, and though the odds were against them, they fought on, driven by the primal need to survive and the flickering hope that they might somehow, against all odds, turn the tide of the war. The situation on the battlefield had grown dire, with each passing moment stretching the limits of the soldiers' endurance. The city, once a bustling center of human achievement, now stood as a hollow shell of its former self, ravaged by war and filled with the echoes of distant explosions. Yet in the midst of this chaos, the soldiers found a renewed sense of purpose. Their comrades had fallen. Their weapons had barely made a dent against the alien invaders. But there was something deeper that kept them going, an unshakable belief that survival was still possible, that as long as they stood, humanity still had a fighting chance. As the soldiers continued to hold the line, the air vibrated with the tension of an imminent defeat. The sound of alien footsteps reverberated through the city, the hulking creatures advancing relentlessly toward the remaining human strongholds. Despite the overwhelming odds, the soldiers had one final, desperate hope left, the weapon that had been wheeled into position. The prototype energy weapon, though unstable and experimental, was humanity's last hope of turning the tide of the battle. As the engineers worked feverishly behind the lines to ensure it was ready, the soldiers knew that the next few moments could either change the course of the war or seal their fate. When the order finally came to fire, It was as if the entire battlefield held its breath. The weapon hummed with power, its core glowing with intense, unstable energy as it charged. The moment it discharged, the blinding beam of energy surged forward, striking one of the alien creatures directly in the chest. The result was immediate and overwhelming. The alien staggered, screeching in agony as it was thrown backward, its massive form crashing to the ground with a force that shook the earth beneath them. The human soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. For the first time in the battle, one of the invaders had fallen, and it felt as though the impossible had been achieved. In that brief moment, the soldiers found a glimmer of hope that they hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. But the victory was short-lived. The surviving aliens, enraged by the loss of one of their own, quickly regrouped and refocused their attention on the weapon that had struck them down. The creatures moved faster and with greater aggression, their actions filled with a newfound sense of purpose. It was clear that they now understood the threat posed by the energy weapon, and they would stop at nothing to destroy it. Despite the human soldiers' best efforts, the battle raged on. The brief sense of victory quickly evaporated as the alien forces continued their relentless advance, and the line between hope and despair once again blurred. The soldiers were forced to confront the reality that even with this powerful weapon, victory was far from guaranteed. But as long as they drew breath, they would continue to fight, knowing that each moment they held out was one more chance to turn the tide in their favor. The battlefield was a scene of absolute devastation, and yet, amidst the carnage, the human soldiers refused to falter. They fought with every ounce of strength they had left, driven by the unyielding will to protect the last remnants of their world. The alien forces, relentless and unyielding, had decimated much of the city and claimed countless lives, but the soldiers' spirit remained intact. Each soldier was fully aware of the odds stacked against them. Outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a terrifying foe, but their resolve remained their greatest asset. They knew that as long as they stood together, there was still hope, however faint it might seem. Despite the overwhelming alien forces, the soldiers continued to mount a defense, holding their positions even as the invaders' overwhelming numbers pressed in on them from all sides. Their weapons, though effective in small bursts, couldn't match the sheer power of the alien assault. Tanks and heavy artillery had been deployed, but even they struggled against the relentless onslaught of creatures with thick, impenetrable exoskeletons. The ground shook with every step the aliens took, their sheer size and strength causing devastation wherever they went. But the soldiers refused to retreat. Every inch of ground they held was a testament to their courage, a refusal to give in even when the end seemed inevitable. In the face of this seemingly insurmountable challenge, the soldiers drew strength from each other. There were moments of fear, moments where even the most seasoned veterans felt the weight of impending doom, but there was also unity in their struggle. The bond formed between them, forged in the heat of battle, became their driving force. They watched as their comrades fell around them, but they pressed on, determined to make every sacrifice count. There was no room for hesitation or doubt. As long as one soldier still stood, there was still a chance for humanity to prevail. They understood the true meaning of resilience, fighting even when the odds were impossible, and continuing to push forward when there seemed to be no reason to. The human forces had no illusions about the difficulty of the fight ahead. The aliens' relentless advance, their ability to adapt, and their seemingly endless numbers left the soldiers with little hope of winning. Yet, even in the darkest moments, they refused to accept defeat. With each passing hour, the soldiers found themselves pushed further and further to the edge, but they held firm, their determination unwavering. They knew the future of humanity rested in their hands, and though it seemed like the end was near, as long as one soldier breathed, the fight would continue. The line between hope and despair grew thinner with every passing moment, but it was that last flicker of hope that kept them going, urging them to stand tall against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The battle had reached a pivotal point, and humanity's last defense lay in the hands of a few determined soldiers who were resolutely holding their ground against the alien onslaught. The remnants of their world were crumbling around them, the city reduced to a war-torn landscape of twisted metal and shattered buildings. Yet, despite the destruction, there was something that set them apart, a raw, primal drive to survive. The soldiers knew that the fate of humanity rested on their shoulders, and with each passing second, they felt the weight of that responsibility more heavily. The odds were stacked against them, and the enemy's forces seemed limitless, but they refused to allow their world to slip into oblivion without a fight. Even as the aliens continued to advance with terrifying precision, the human soldiers fought back with everything they had. Their weapons, although largely ineffective against the alien exoskeletons, continued to fire, sending tracer rounds streaking across the battlefield in a desperate attempt to slow the invaders. Tanks roared in the distance, heavy shells crashing into alien ranks, but the creatures seemed impervious to most forms of attack. They tore through the remnants of humanity's defenses with unrelenting force, their strength and numbers overwhelming everything in their path. Yet the soldiers stood firm, knowing that as long as they could delay the aliens, they bought precious time for the remaining forces to regroup. In the chaos of the ongoing battle, there were moments of brilliance where the soldiers' ingenuity and resolve shone through. Despite the horrors surrounding them, they had managed to prepare a last-ditch weapon, a prototype energy device that had the potential to turn the tide of the war. The weapon hummed with an unstable power, but it was humanity's best chance. When it finally discharged, a beam of concentrated energy shot across the battlefield, striking one of the alien giants. For a fleeting moment, there was a glimmer of hope as the alien was brought down by the sheer force of the blast. The soldiers allowed themselves a brief moment of celebration, knowing that they had dealt a blow to the seemingly unstoppable enemy. However, this victory was short-lived, as the aliens quickly adapted, focusing their wrath on the new threat that had emerged. Despite the setbacks, the soldiers remained resolute, driven by an instinct to survive and the knowledge that as long as they continued to fight, humanity's future was not entirely lost. Even though they were outnumbered and outgunned, the soldiers refused to give in to despair. The alien forces were formidable, but the human will to survive was just as powerful. Each soldier clung to the belief that they could still make a difference, that if they held the line just a little longer, the tide could shift in their favor. In the darkest moments of the battle, when it seemed like the invaders would overwhelm them, the soldiers pressed on, their resolve hardening like steel. They fought not just for their own survival, but for the survival of the entire human race. And as long as one soldier still stood, the fight would continue, no matter how hopeless it seemed.